Hi guys, and welcome to History That Makes You Sleepy. Tonight we imagine you stepping into a frozen world where the wind does not just blow across the land, it dominates it, erasing sound, erasing direction, and sometimes even erasing your sense of time itself. You're walking into a blizzard camp where thin tents tremble like living things, and every breath you take feels slightly borrowed from survival itself. And honestly, you probably would not survive this for long without help, because nature here does not negotiate, it simply continues. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me where you are listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. It always feels strangely comforting to imagine all of us scattered across different nights, sharing the same quiet story. Now, dim the lights. Flow straight into the story, no extra headings. You're there now, standing at the edge of a temporary winter camp somewhere in a historical cold frontier landscape. The snow is not falling gently. It is moving sideways, as if the sky itself has tilted and decided to pour winter directly into your face. The tents around you are not sturdy structures in the modern sense. They are thin skins of fabric and hide stretched over fragile frames, each one barely resisting the pressure of the storm. A mainstream historical fact is that human groups across many regions used simple tents as seasonal shelters, long before permanent housing was possible in harsh climates, especially during migrations and hunting cycles. That reality becomes very clear to you now as you watch these shelters behave like breathing creatures under pressure. You take a step forward, and your boots sink into snow that immediately tries to claim your balance. Every movement feels delayed, as if the cold itself is slowing your thoughts. Your hands sting even through gloves or wrapped cloth, because moisture and wind together form a kind of invisible bite. You notice that visibility changes every few seconds. One moment you can see 10 meters ahead. The next moment everything is erased into white motion. A quirky tidbit from historical winter travel accounts suggests that some travelers once believed certain blizzards followed them intentionally, as if storms had memory or preference. Standing here, you almost understand why such beliefs emerged. The storm feels less like weather and more like presence. You move closer to the central area of the camp where faint movement suggests other people are working. Figures bend into the wind, adjusting ropes and reinforcing tent lines. Their motions are repetitive, practiced, and quiet. No one speaks much because words are immediately stolen by the wind. Instead, communication becomes gestures, nods, and the occasional sharp signal. You notice how the tents are arranged carefully, not randomly. Even here, survival depends on positioning. The entrances face away from the strongest wind direction. Snowdrifts are already forming protective walls on one side, whether intentionally or naturally shaped by the storm. Everything is about reducing exposure, even slightly. Historians still argue whether such camp arrangements were primarily planned through formal knowledge or gradually learned through repeated failure across generations. Either way, what stands in front of you is not chaos. It is adaptation made visible. You crouch near one of the tents. The fabric is rough against your fingertips, stiff with cold. It is surprisingly thin, and yet it holds back a world of freezing air. Inside, you can sense warmth, but only just barely. The difference between inside and outside is not comfort and discomfort. It is survival and immediate danger. The wind suddenly shifts, and the entire camp seems to react. Tent walls ripple, ropes tighten and loosen in unpredictable rhythm. A distant sound rises, something like a low roar, though there is nothing visible making it. In a blizzard, sound becomes unreliable, bending and reflecting off snow in ways that confuse your instincts. You step toward your assigned shelter. The entrance flap resists, stiffened by frost. When you finally lift it, a wave of warmer air touches your face. Though warm is relative, inside, bodies are already present, huddled close together, conserving every possible trace of heat. You pause for a moment at the threshold, feeling the contrast between the violent open air and the enclosed fragility inside. This is your world now, at least for this night. The interior space is cramped, filled with the smell of damp wool, smoke residue, and human breath. Everything here is about reducing heat loss. Even small movements are controlled. You notice how people shift slightly rather than fully repositioning, as if motion itself is expensive. Outside, the storm continues without concern for what you're experiencing. Inside, life continues in a smaller, more concentrated form. Every sound is softer here. Every breath feels shared. You lower yourself into the tent space, and the ground beneath you is already partially warmed by others. That shared warmth is the only barrier between you and the cold that waits just beyond the fabric walls. The wind presses again, harder this time, and the tent responds like a living membrane. For a moment, you wonder how long something this fragile can truly hold, but it does hold. For now, and in this fragile balance between exposure and shelter, you begin to understand what this kind of survival really meant. Not as an abstract historical idea, but as a physical, ongoing negotiation with cold that never stops moving. You settle deeper into the tent, and the first thing you truly understand is how little separation there is between you and the storm outside. It is not like being indoors in any modern sense. It is more like being inside a thin pause in the weather, a temporary hesitation in something that never truly stops. Your hands are still cold, even inside. The warmth here is not produced. It is borrowed from bodies, from shared breath, from the simple fact that people are close enough to leak heat into one another. You shift slightly, careful not to disturb the fragile balance of space. Every movement matters more than it should. A mainstream historical fact is that many nomadic and expeditionary cultures relied on portable shelters precisely because fixed buildings were impossible in extreme seasonal environments, especially during long winter migrations or hunting journeys. That idea becomes very real as you feel the tent flex again under another gust, as if reminding you that permanence is not part of this life. Outside, the storm grows louder without sound, if that makes sense. You do not hear it directly so much as feel it pressing against the fabric, a constant invisible weight. The tent poles creak faintly. Rope fibers tighten and relax in uneven rhythm. You begin to understand that silence in a blizzard is not absence. It is pressure. You adjust your position slightly and notice how everyone else inside has already adopted similar careful postures. Knees drawn in, shoulders close, head slightly bowed, not out of ritual but efficiency. The human body becomes a tool for heat conservation. A quirky tidbit from historical accounts of winter travel suggests that some early explorers believed talking too much inside tents could use up warmth, a misunderstanding of breath condensation and heat loss that still reveals how closely survival and superstition once intertwined. You almost smile at that now, because even silence here feels practical. Someone nearby shifts and a faint rustle of fabric follows. You cannot see faces clearly in the dim interior light. Everything is reduced to outlines and movement. The air feels thicker inside, not because it is physically denser, but because it is shared. Every exhale adds to it. You notice small details you would normally ignore. The frost forming on inner fabric where warm breath meets cold wool, the way condensation occasionally falls in tiny droplets when heat meets freezing tension. Even time feels slower here, as if the storm outside has stretched every moment. Historians still argue whether such intimate sleeping arrangements in extreme cold were primarily driven by cultural practice or pure necessity, but standing here, The distinction no longer feels meaningful. The body does what it must. You feel a shift near the entrance. Someone adjusts the flap, briefly letting in a thin blade of wind. The cold does not rush in dramatically. It seeps, quiet, and immediate. Everyone reacts instinctively, tightening closer together for a moment until the barrier is sealed again. The tent steadies. You begin to understand how much attention is required just to maintain this fragile interior world. Nothing here is passive. Everything is being actively held together by constant, quiet effort. You lie down carefully, or at least half recline, following the shape others have already made in the snow-matted ground beneath coverings. The surface is uneven but warm enough in places where bodies have been resting longer. You feel the difference immediately, like layers of memory stored in heat. Breathing becomes more noticeable in this position. You hear it more than the wind now. Slow, synchronized patterns form without intention, not identical, but harmonized by proximity. It is strangely calming, even in discomfort. Outside, the storm intensifies again. The fabric above you tightens, then relaxes, like a lung inhaling and exhaling. You begin to think of the tent not as a shelter, but as a living interface between two extremes, warmth and annihilation. A mainstream historical fact is that early winter expeditions often recorded temperature drops that could reach life-threatening levels overnight, especially in exposed environments where wind chill dramatically increased risk. That knowledge makes your current fragility feel less imagined and more grounded in reality. You turn your head slightly and notice how careful everyone is not to create gaps between bodies. Even small separations matter. Heat escapes quickly, and cold fills any space left behind. The logic of survival here is almost geometric. A quirky tidbit from frontier travel stories suggests that some groups use shared sleeping rhythms, agreeing informally on when to shift positions so no one remained exposed to outer edges too long. Whether fully accurate or not, the idea reflects how cooperation becomes mechanical in extreme environments. Your thoughts slow gradually, not because of comfort, but because energy conservation seems to extend even into thinking. The cold outside demands less movement, less resistance, less awareness of anything unnecessary. You listen to the storm again. It is still there, always there, but now it feels slightly distant, as if you have sunk beneath its surface. The tent holds, just barely, and that small fact becomes everything. You realize survival here is not about defeating the storm. It is about agreeing to exist beside it without breaking. And in that fragile agreement, the night continues. You wake into a kind of half-awareness that does not feel like morning, because there is no true morning inside a blizzard camp. Light changes, but it does not arrive in a clean way. It filters through the tent walls as a dull, diffused glow, like the world outside has been softened and erased at the edges. Your body feels heavier than before, not from sleep alone, but from cold that has settled into joints and muscles overnight. You shift slightly and immediately notice how every small movement requires a decision. Nothing is automatic here. Even turning your head feels like an act of negotiation with temperature. Outside, the storm has not stopped. It never really does in the way you might expect. Instead, it changes tone, like a continuous argument that never resolves. The wind presses against the tent in slow pulses, sometimes sharp, sometimes dragging, always present. A mainstream historical fact is that many pre-modern winter expeditions recorded entire days where visibility remained near zero, forcing travelers to remain inside shelters and conserve energy until conditions shifted. That idea becomes very real to you now, because movement outside the tent feels almost impossible to imagine. Inside, people begin to stir, not quickly, not energetically, but in careful increments. Someone reaches for a shared container, another adjusts a layer of fabric. The sounds are minimal, almost ritualized. Even breathing feels coordinated, as if the tent itself encourages rhythm over chaos. You notice how the air has changed overnight. It feels slightly heavier with moisture from breath, yet still painfully dry at the edges where cold leaks through. The contrast is strange. Warmth exists, but it is uneven, distributed in patches rather than filling the space. A quirky tidbit from historical winter travel accounts suggests that some groups believed sleeping closer to the center of a tent would improve not only warmth, but also fortune, as if physical proximity to others created protective luck. Whether or not they truly believed it literally, the behavior itself reflects a deep understanding of heat distribution and survival instinct. You slowly sit up. The ground beneath you is no longer just snow and earth. It is a layered surface of compressed insulation, fabric, and the lingering warmth of bodies. It feels temporary, fragile, and yet strangely reliable in its own limited way. Someone near the entrance adjusts the flap again. A thin strip of outside light sharpens for a moment, revealing the edge of the storm world beyond. It is not clearer. It is just brighter in a way that feels almost aggressive. The wind immediately pushes against that opening, reminding everyone that the boundary is not stable. Historians still argue whether such constant maintenance of tent integrity during blizzards was more physically exhausting than the travel itself. But when you watch how often small adjustments are required, the question no longer feels abstract. It feels practical and immediate. You reach for a piece of clothing and notice how stiff it has become overnight. Fabric behaves differently in extreme cold. It resists bending, almost snapping into shape rather than flowing. You work it slowly, warming it with your hands before it becomes wearable again. Outside, the sound shifts again. There is a deeper tone now, something like distant rolling pressure. It is not thunder. It is wind interacting with terrain, snow, and fabric structures across the camp. The entire environment seems to participate in the noise. You step closer to the center of the tent where warmth is slightly stronger. The difference is subtle but noticeable, like moving from one faint memory of heat into another. People avoid direct contact with the outer edges whenever possible. The tent walls are cold enough to steal warmth instantly. A mainstream historical fact is that in extreme cold environments, group sleeping arrangements were often essential for survival, especially when heating sources were limited or unreliable. That fact is no longer theoretical to you. It is physical. You feel it in every degree of shared warmth. Someone passes a small portion of food. It is simple, dense, and preserved for endurance rather than enjoyment. Eating is slow, not because of taste, but because everything must be rationed, including energy used for digestion and movement. As you chew, you notice how the act of eating feels strangely disconnected from pleasure. It is maintenance, like reinforcing a wall or tightening a rope, necessary, but stripped of excess. A quirky tidbit from historical accounts of cold climate travel suggests that some groups use chewing itself as a way to generate perceived warmth, focusing on slow, sustained motion to distract from temperature discomfort. Even if exaggerated in memory, it shows how closely body and environment were mentally linked. You glance around the tent interior again. The space feels smaller now, not physically, but perceptually. The storm outside compresses your sense of scale. Everything beyond the fabric seems distant and indistinct, as if the world has narrowed down to this single enclosed volume. A faint sound draws your attention. It might be someone outside calling, or it might be wind shaping itself into something that resembles voice. In blizzards, perception becomes unreliable. Even familiar sounds lose certainty. You shift your weight and feel a slight draft near the ground. Someone immediately adjusts a covering without speaking. These micro-responses happen constantly, almost instinctively. The tent is maintained through shared awareness rather than instruction. Historians still argue whether such coordinated survival behavior in temporary camps was learned through formal tradition or developed spontaneously through repeated exposure to extreme conditions. But watching it unfold makes it clear that adaptation does not always require explanation to function. Time becomes difficult to measure. There are no clear markers, only cycles of movement, rest, adjustment, and listening. The storm outside remains the constant reference point, the only thing that never changes in its persistence. You realize that sleeping here is not simply rest. It is a negotiated pause in vulnerability. Every moment of rest is balanced against exposure, warmth against loss, stillness against survival risk. And as your body settles again into shared warmth, you begin to understand that in this place, even sleep is a form of active endurance. You are now more aware of the tent itself than of anything outside it, as if your senses have begun to accept this thin structure as the entire boundary of existence. The storm still exists beyond it, but it feels distant in the way a dream feels distant after waking, present but unreachable. You run your hand along the interior surface of the shelter. It is rough, cold, and slightly damp where breath has condensed overnight. The fabric does not feel like protection in any modern sense. It feels like negotiation. Every fibre is participating in a quiet struggle against freezing air that wants to reclaim the space inside. The materials around you are simple, but their simplicity hides their importance. Animal hide stitched together with plant fibre, early woven cloth thickened with layers of wool, sometimes reinforced with resin or grease to slow the intrusion of moisture. None of it is perfect. All of it is just enough. One widely accepted historical observation is that early cold climate societies relied heavily on layered natural materials to create survivable shelters long before synthetic insulation existed, and those combinations were often refined through generations of trial and observation rather than formal engineering. You notice how the tent responds differently depending on where the wind strikes. Some sections flex inward like breathing skin, while others remain stiff and resistant. It is not uniform. It behaves like something assembled from compromise rather than design. Outside, the storm shifts again. The sound is not consistent. It rises and falls in waves, creating the impression of movement even when nothing visible is moving. Snow itself becomes a kind of force that reshapes perception. You begin to understand why people in these environments often described weather as something with intention. You adjust your position slightly and feel how quickly warmth disappears when you move away from others. Heat here is not stored. It is shared. The tent does not generate warmth. It only preserves fragments of it for short periods before they escape into the cold. An odd surviving note from historical winter travellers describes how certain fabrics were treated with animal fat or oils to improve resistance against wind and moisture, creating a subtle barrier that could slow heat loss just enough to matter over long nights. You imagine that coating now, invisible but essential, holding back the edge of freezing air. Your fingers are beginning to regain slight sensation, but it is uneven. Some areas feel sharp with returning warmth while others remain dull and distant. Cold does not leave evenly. It withdraws in patches, as if reluctant to release its grip completely. You notice the ceiling of the tent again. Small droplets of moisture form and occasionally fall back onto the ground or fabric below. It is a cycle of breath and frost, human warmth turning into water, water turning back into ice. The tent is constantly translating between states of matter. Academic discussions remain unsettled on whether early tent construction techniques evolved primarily through environmental necessity or through shared cultural exchange between distant groups. But what is clear to you now is that every stitch here represents survival knowledge made physical. A faint shift in light outside suggests time has moved forward. though there is still no clear sense of day. The storm filters everything into uniform brightness, removing shadows, removing contrast, removing certainty. You lean back slightly and feel the ground beneath you. It is not flat. It has been shaped by repeated bodies resting in the same positions. Warmth lingers in those depressions like a temporary memory. You can feel where others have been, even if they are not moving now. The air inside the tent feels thick with shared breath. Not uncomfortable, but noticeable. Each exhale contributes to a collective warmth that barely resists the cold pressing from outside. It is a fragile balance maintained unconsciously by everyone present. You become aware of your clothing again. Layers matter here in a way that feels almost mathematical. Each layer is not just insulation but a delay in heat loss. Wool traps air, fur resists wind. Even damp fabric becomes dangerous because moisture draws heat away faster than dry cold ever could. One established historical reality is that survival in extreme winter conditions depended less on absolute warmth and more on the management of heat loss over time, especially during periods of forced inactivity such as sleeping inside tents during storms. You shift your shoulders and notice how quickly the cold returns to any exposed area. Even a small gap between fabric and skin becomes a pathway for heat to escape. Everything is about minimizing those gaps. Nothing can be left open. A lesser-known anecdote from frontier travel diaries mentions that some groups would deliberately rotate sleeping positions throughout the night, so that no one remained too long near the outer edges of shared warmth, treating proximity itself as a rotating resource. Whether fully accurate or exaggerated in memory, it reflects a deeply practical logic. You listen again to the wind. It is still present, but it feels less aggressive now, more like an ongoing condition rather than an active threat. That change in perception is subtle but important. Your mind begins to adapt, not by ignoring the storm, but by normalizing its presence. Inside the tent, movement resumes in small bursts. Someone tightens a rope, another adjusts a covering, a container is passed quietly from hand to hand. Everything is efficient, almost ritualistic. No action is wasted. Even conversation, when it happens, is brief and purposeful. You notice how the fabric overhead sometimes tightens suddenly, then relaxes. Each change corresponds to shifts in wind pressure outside. It is as if the entire shelter is constantly listening to the storm and responding without words. Academic debate still circles around whether such shelters were more effective as physical barriers or psychological ones. But standing here, you realize the distinction might not matter. Protection in this environment is both material and mental. Your breathing slows slightly, not because you are fully relaxed, but because your body begins to accept the rhythm of this space. Inhale, shared air. Exhale into shared air. Rest between movements. Wait between impulses. The storm defines the tempo. You close your eyes for a moment, and the sound of the wind becomes less distinct. It is still there, but it blends into a continuous background presence, like something that has always existed rather than something that began. In this fragile enclosure, warmth is not a condition you have achieved, it is a condition you are participating in. And that participation requires constant kuwandoln, quiet agreement with everyone else inside. Outside, the storm continues without change. Inside, survival continues without pause. And you begin to understand that in these tents, warmth was never owned. It was shared just long enough to last the night. You're no longer surprised by the sound of the wind. It has become something like a second layer of reality, always present, always pressing, but slowly fading into the background of your attention. What once felt like a violent force now feels like a condition of existence, like gravity you simply live inside. The light inside the tent shifts again. Not brighter, not darker, just different in quality. It carries the faint suggestion of time passing outside, though the storm makes it impossible to trust what time even means here. Morning, afternoon, night all feel flattened into the same pale grey awareness. Your body feels stiff at first, then gradually responsive as you move. Cold is still present in your joints, but it is no longer shocking. It has settled into you like an unwelcome companion that refuses to leave, but no longer demands panic. A widely recognised historical fact is that survival in extreme winter environments often depended on carefully timed rest cycles, where people alternated between sleep and maintenance tasks to conserve energy and preserve body heat over long storms that could last for days without relief. Inside the tent, someone passes a small container again. You take a portion. It is simple food, dense and functional, designed more for endurance than satisfaction. You notice how little appetite matters in conditions like this. Eating becomes a form of maintenance, like tightening a strap or adjusting a shelter line. As you chew slowly, you become aware of how silence dominates the interior. Not absolute silence, because there is always breath, fabric movement, and faint creaking of structure, but a muted silence shaped by survival focus. Even thoughts feel quieter. A curious historical anecdote suggests that some early winter travellers believed that speaking too much inside enclosed shelters could weaken collective focus and increase perceived cold, a belief likely rooted in the very real effect of distraction on energy conservation and body awareness. You shift your weight and feel how the ground has changed under repeated use. It is no longer just terrain. It is shaped by presence, flattened areas, slightly warmer pockets, subtle depressions where bodies have rested. The tent floor is becoming a record of survival. Outside, the wind suddenly intensifies for a moment. The entire tent reacts at once. Fabric tightens, ropes strain, and a low vibrating sound passes through the structure. It is not fear-inducing anymore. It is simply information. The storm is still active, still dominant, still ongoing. You glance toward the entrance. A faint glow leaks through the edges of the flap. It is not sunlight in any comforting sense, just a shift in brightness that suggests the storm is not total. There is a world beyond it, though it feels unreachable. Scholarly interpretations of such conditions remain divided on whether prolonged exposure to blizzard environments caused more physical exhaustion or psychological strain, but here you feel how those two experiences cannot be separated. The body and mind respond together. You notice your breath more clearly now. It is visible in faint traces, dissolving quickly into the air shared with others. Each exhale slightly warms the interior, and each inhale slightly cools it again. It is a constant exchange that defines existence in this space. Someone adjusts a layer near the edge of the tent. The movement is small but noticeable. A brief draft slips in, and the cold touches your skin like a reminder. Everyone reacts instinctively by tightening closer together again, restoring balance without words. You begin to understand that survival here is less about resisting cold and more about managing exposure in continuous small corrections. Nothing is stable for long. Everything requires attention. A lesser-known detail from frontier winter accounts describes how some groups would mark time not by hours, but by the need to adjust shelter components, effectively measuring the day through maintenance cycles rather than clocks. That idea feels strangely fitting here. Your muscles relax slightly as you settle into a more comfortable position. Comfort is a relative term now. It does not mean warmth in any full sense. It means slightly less exposure, slightly less strain, slightly more stability within the fragile interior environment. The tent fabric above you shifts again with another gust. It creates a pattern of sound that is almost rhythmic. You start to recognize repetitions in the storm, as if even chaos has structure if you listen long enough. One established historical reality is that many cold climate survival groups developed highly efficient cooperative behaviors inside temporary shelters. where resource sharing and spatial awareness were essential to prevent heat loss and maintain group survival over extended exposure periods. You notice how even small gestures carry meaning here. A shift of shoulder, a slight repositioning, a passing object. Everything is communication without speech. Efficiency replaces language in many moments. Outside, the storm does not change in intensity, but your perception of it continues to shift. What once felt overwhelming now feels constant. What once felt immediate now feels distant. Adaptation is happening without your permission. A reflective historical note often discussed among scholars is whether human endurance in extreme environments is driven more by physical resilience or by rapid behavioral adaptation, and in this moment you can feel how both are inseparable. You lie back again and let your body distribute weight across the uneven ground. The warmth from others is faint but present. It is not comforting in a soft sense. It is functional. It keeps you within survivable range. Your thoughts slow further, not into sleep yet, but into a lower frequency of awareness. The storm remains, but it no longer dominates your attention completely. It becomes background, like a distant engine that never turns off. Inside this fragile tent, surrounded by breath and fabric and shared heat, you realize something simple and heavy. Survival here was never about escaping the cold. It was about agreeing to live beside it for as long as necessary, and that agreement continues through the night. You notice something subtle as the night deepens inside the tent, though night is not truly visible in the way it would be outside of this storm. It is more a shift in pressure, a feeling that time has thickened and slowed until it almost rests on top of you. The warmth inside the shelter has not increased, but your awareness of it has become more precise. You can feel where heat is strongest, where it fades, where it lingers only because bodies are close enough to lend it for a while. It is not comfort exactly, but it is enough to keep awareness from slipping too far into panic. A widely accepted historical fact is that in extreme cold climates, sleeping arrangements often relied on close physical proximity to conserve body heat, especially in temporary shelters during storms or migration periods when fuel sources were limited or unavailable. You shift slightly and immediately feel the difference between shared warmth and exposed air. Even a small movement creates a brief imbalance, as if the tent itself reacts to your decision. Nothing here is passive. Everything responds. Someone nearby adjusts their position as well, and the fabric above you shifts in response. The tent behaves like a living boundary, reacting to every internal and external force at once. It is fragile, but also surprisingly adaptive in its own limited way. A quirky tidbit from historical winter travel accounts describes how some groups believed that aligning sleeping bodies in specific orientations within tents could improve warmth retention, almost like arranging human bodies as parts of a larger thermal system. Whether symbolic or practical, the behavior reflects deep observational learning. You begin to notice breathing more clearly now, not just your own, but the collective rhythm of everyone inside. It rises and falls in uneven harmony. Some breaths are shallow, others deeper, but together they form a kind of shared atmosphere. Outside, the storm presses harder for a moment. The sound increases, not in clarity but in intensity, like a wave of pressure rolling across the tent surface. You can feel it more than hear it, a vibration that passes through fabric and ground alike. You pull your layers closer around your body, and the act itself becomes a kind of routine. Clothing here is not just protection, it is management. Each layer delays heat loss, each adjustment buys time. Scholars still debate whether early winter survival techniques were primarily inherited through structured knowledge systems, or developed independently in isolated groups facing similar environmental pressures. But the result in front of you is unmistakably effective. The tent interior feels slightly more enclosed now, as if the storm outside has compressed the space inward. You're aware of every surface, the ground beneath you, the fabric above, the bodies around you. There is no wasted perception. A mainstream historical fact is that many pre-industrial winter expeditions reported significant reductions in mobility during storms, often remaining inside shelters for extended periods while carefully rationing food, fuel, and movement to preserve survival capacity. You reach for a small portion of food again. It is cold, firm, and functional. You eat slowly, not out of enjoyment, but because speed does not matter here. Everything is measured in endurance, not satisfaction. As you swallow, you notice how your body responds differently to effort in this environment. Even simple digestion feels like part of a larger system of conservation. Energy is not wasted, it is redirected. A lesser-known anecdote from frontier diaries suggests that some travellers used repetitive internal counting or mental focus techniques during storms to maintain calm, treating thought itself as a resource to be controlled rather than a free flow of attention. You glance toward the tent wall. Frost patterns have formed more clearly now, delicate and branching like frozen memories spreading across the fabric. Each pattern marks the boundary where warm breath meets freezing air. The storm outside continues its invisible pressure. It never stops, but it changes texture. Sometimes it feels like a constant push, sometimes like scattered impacts, sometimes like a low continuous roar that has no beginning or end. You become aware of how still everyone inside is trying to be, not frozen in fear, but carefully efficient. Movement is minimized, energy is conserved, even conversation, when it happens, is reduced to necessary signals. A reflective historical observation often noted in survival studies is that human groups in extreme cold environments tend to develop rapid behavioral synchronization, where individual actions gradually align into collective patterns that reduce overall energy loss and improve group survival chances. You adjust your posture again and feel how quickly the warmth shifts. It is always unstable, always in motion. The only constant is change, and the effort required to stay within survivable limits. Outside, the wind changes direction slightly, and the tent responds with a subtle reorientation of tension. Ropes tighten in different places, fabric pulls in new angles. It is like watching an organism adapt without awareness. You close your eyes briefly and listen. The storm is still present, but it feels less like an enemy now and more like an environment that simply exists, indifferent and ongoing. Inside this enclosed space, survival is not dramatic. It is repetitive, quiet, and continuous. Adjust, breathe, conserve, wait, repeat. And in that repetition, the night continues without end. You notice the fire before you fully see it, because even in this storm, fire announces itself differently. It is not brightness first. It is warmth, a subtle shift in the air that makes the inside of the tent feel briefly more human, more fragile in a way that comfort almost makes dangerous. A small flame has been coaxed into existence somewhere near the center of the shelter system, likely in a slightly more protected outer enclosure or a shared windbreak area. It flickers unevenly, struggling to remain stable against the pressure of moving air that never fully leaves this environment. A widely accepted historical fact is that fire was essential for survival in extreme winter conditions, not only for warmth, but also for melting snow into drinkable water and for preserving morale during prolonged storms in temporary camps. You move closer, careful not to disturb the balance of bodies and space inside the tent. Even small movements feel amplified in importance. The flame is visible now through a gap in the fabric layers, a trembling orange presence fighting against cold air that seems to want to erase it completely. Someone near the opening adjusts a covering, trying to shield the fire from gusts. The effect is immediate but unstable. The flame steadies for a moment, then leans sideways as if reacting to an invisible push. It feels less like control and more like negotiation again. A quirky tidbit from historical expedition accounts suggests that some travellers believed fire could sense approaching storms, because flames would behave erratically before wind changes became fully noticeable. While this is clearly interpretation rather than science, it reflects how closely people observed natural signals. Inside the tent, the shared warmth shifts slightly as attention focuses outward toward the fire source. Even though it is not inside your immediate space, its presence changes everything. It introduces a second center of survival, a fragile anchor in the storm. Outside, the wind intensifies again. The tent responds instantly, fabric tightening and loosening in waves. The sound of the storm rises into a low, continuous pressure, as if the air itself is being dragged across uneven terrain. You can feel how carefully the fire is being managed. Not too much fuel, not too little oxygen. Every adjustment matters. In this environment, fire is not freedom, it is responsibility. Scholars still debate whether early winter camps relied more heavily on centralized fire points or distributed small heat sources within multiple shelters. But what you are witnessing suggests a highly coordinated effort to balance heat, safety, and fuel efficiency. You sit back slightly, feeling the warmth that radiates faintly through layers of fabric and human presence. It does not reach you fully, but it changes the atmosphere enough that your body responds instinctively. Shoulders relax slightly, breathing slows. The tent interior feels different now, not safe, but less tense. Fire changes perception. It introduces contrast into a world that has been almost entirely uniform in cold and grey. A mainstream historical fact is that controlled fire use in temporary winter settlements significantly improves survival rates, particularly in regions where temperatures dropped rapidly, and sustained exposure without heat sources would have been lethal. You notice how people adjust again. Some shift closer to the direction of warmth. Others remain in place, maintaining structure. No one speaks. Communication happens through movement alone, subtle and efficient. The flame outside flickers violently for a moment, and the light briefly pulses through the fabric layers. Shadows move across surfaces inside the tent, creating the illusion of motion even where there is none. It is disorienting, almost dreamlike. A lesser-known anecdote from frontier travel records describes how some groups would take turns guarding fires through the night, not only to maintain warmth, but to protect against wind shifts that could extinguish it unexpectedly. The responsibility was shared, often without formal assignment. You feel a slight change in temperature as the fire stabilizes again. It is not a large increase, but even small shifts matter enormously here. Heat is never abundant. It is always on the edge of disappearance. Your hands begin to feel slightly more responsive, not warm, but less distant. Sensation returns in uneven waves, as if your body is remembering itself slowly. Outside, the storm continues without interruption. It does not react to the fire. It does not acknowledge it. The blizzard remains indifferent, a system of movement and pressure that continues regardless of human effort. You realize how strange it is that two opposing forces coexist so closely. Fire and wind, heat and cold, protection and exposure. Neither wins. Both simply persist. A reflective historical observation often discussed among researchers is that human survival in extreme environments depends less on controlling nature and more on maintaining fragile balances between opposing forces. A concept that becomes visible here in the tension between flame and storm. You lean slightly toward the center again, drawn not just by warmth, but by the psychological effect of it. Fire gathers attention. It creates focus. It gives direction in a place where direction is otherwise meaningless. The tent feels more alive now. Not because it has changed, but because perception has shifted. You're more aware of every small interaction between heat, fabric, breath, and wind. The storm outside remains powerful, but it is no longer the only presence you feel. Inside this fragile system of shelter and flame, survival becomes something shared between elements that constantly threaten to undo each other, and you remain in the middle of that balance, simply enduring. You start to understand that even safety here is temporary, and that realization does not arrive as panic, but as a quiet awareness that nothing in this environment stays stable for long. The fire you felt earlier, the warmth shared inside the tent, even your own sense of orientation, all of it exists in shifting conditions. The tent fabric above you suddenly dips slightly, and for a brief moment your attention locks onto it. Snow has begun to accumulate on the outer surface, invisible but heavy, pressing downward with patient persistence. It does not collapse quickly. It changes the structure slowly, like a hand pressing into soft material over time. A widely recognized historical fact is that snow accumulation on temporary shelters has always been one of the greatest risks in extreme winter environments, because weight can build gradually and silently until structural failure occurs without warning. You notice others becoming subtly more alert, not frantic, not alarmed, but attentive in a way that suggests constant background awareness of structural load. Someone shifts near the support lines, adjusting tension slightly. Another person checks the angle of a pole. Everything is done without words. Outside, the wind continues, but now it interacts with the snow in different ways. You can hear occasional deeper tones, like pressure moving across uneven surfaces. The storm is no longer just air. It is air combined with weight, texture, and accumulation. You move your head slightly and feel how the tent responds. It is no longer just flexing sideways. It is also resisting downward pressure. The structure is working in multiple directions at once, balancing forces that never stop changing. A lesser-known anecdote from historical travel accounts suggests that some expedition groups would periodically tap or gently shake tent supports during storms to prevent dangerous build-up of snow, a practice born from observation rather than formal engineering knowledge. Inside the shelter, the fire continues to flicker at a safer distance. Its presence still matters, but attention has partially shifted upward now. Warmth is no longer the only concern. Stability becomes equally important. You realize how quickly priorities change in this environment. Warmth, structure, airflow, body position, all of them compete for attention without hierarchy. Survival is not linear here, it is simultaneous. Scholars still debate whether the greatest risk in blizzard tent survival was hypothermia from exposure or structural failure from prolonged snow load. But in practice, both risks are intertwined, each capable of triggering the other. You adjust your posture slightly, careful not to disturb the balance of shared space. Even small shifts feel consequential. The ground beneath you has softened further from repeated use and retained warmth, creating subtle depressions that guide where bodies naturally settle. A quirky tidbit from frontier winter narratives suggests that some travellers believed snow listened to warmth, claiming it would accumulate more heavily around warmer shelters, a poetic misunderstanding of wind patterns and thermal gradients that still reveals how people tried to explain unpredictable conditions. Your attention drifts briefly to the edges of the tent again. Frost patterns have thickened there, forming intricate designs where breath and cold meet repeatedly. It looks almost deliberate, like nature is sketching boundaries in real time. Outside, the storm shifts again. There is a sudden unevenness in sound, as if wind is striking different surfaces at different angles. The entire environment feels layered now, not just horizontal movement, but vertical pressure, drifting accumulation, and shifting density. You feel a slight change in airflow near your face. Someone has adjusted a covering again, carefully managing ventilation. Too much air movement would strip heat. Too little would make breathing uncomfortable. Balance must be constantly maintained. A mainstream historical fact is that survival shelters in extreme cold environments required continuous micro-adjustments to ventilation and structure, since both overheating and oxygen limitation could become problems even in freezing conditions when fire and bodies are enclosed together. The fire flickers again, and for a moment the light dances across the tent interior in uneven patterns. Shadows stretch and contract, making the space feel larger and smaller in alternating rhythm. It is strangely hypnotic, almost dreamlike. You notice how your awareness of temperature has become more refined. You can now sense small gradients within the tent, slightly warmer near the center, cooler near the edges, cooler still near fabric surfaces where heat escapes. A reflective historical observation often discussed among survival researchers is that humans in extreme environments develop heightened sensitivity to thermal variation, effectively recalibrating perception to detect differences that would normally go unnoticed. You shift again, and this time the movement is slower, more deliberate. Energy conservation is not just physical, it becomes behavioral. Even thought begins to prioritize efficiency over exploration. The tent structure creaks softly under shifting load. It is not a sharp sound, but a prolonged one, like something adjusting rather than breaking. Still, every sound draws attention, because sound here always carries meaning. You glance toward others and notice the same quiet monitoring. Everyone is listening without acknowledging it. The storm is constantly being interpreted through indirect signals, through fabric tension, through air pressure, through sound. Scholars still debate whether early winter survival knowledge was primarily transmitted through explicit instruction or through immersive experiential learning. But what you are experiencing now is clearly the latter, where understanding comes through constant exposure rather than explanation. The fire steadies again, and the tent interior briefly feels more cohesive, not safer, but more unified. Light, heat, breath, and fabric align for a moment in fragile balance. You settle deeper into place, feeling the shared warmth beneath and around you. The storm continues outside, unchanged in purpose, indifferent to all effort within, and yet, inside this thin structure, life continues through adjustment, attention, and constant quiet coordination. Even under snow, even under pressure, the night does not end, it only shifts form. You begin to notice that the storm has its own rhythm, even if it is not a rhythm you can easily predict. It arrives in waves of pressure, then briefly relaxes, then returns again with a different kind of force. It never fully disappears, but it never remains identical either. The fire is still present somewhere beyond the immediate center of attention. But your focus has shifted again, not because warmth no longer matters, but because sound has changed. The tent is producing new noises now, subtle ones, as snow continues to accumulate outside and reshape how the structure carries weight. A widely accepted historical fact is that prolonged blizzard conditions often altered the acoustic environment inside temporary shelters, making external wind sound distorted, amplified, or uneven due to snow layers and fabric tension changes. You lie still for a moment and listen more carefully. The sound is no longer just wind, it feels layered. Some tones are low and continuous, others short and sharp. At times it almost resembles distant movement, though you know nothing is moving out there except air and snow. Someone shifts near the edge of the tent and the fabric responds with a soft, delayed creak. That sound lingers longer than expected, as if the structure itself is holding tension for a moment before releasing it. A quirky tidbit from historical winter travel accounts suggests that some travellers described blizzard nights as noisy silence, a phrase used to capture the paradox of hearing constant pressure without identifiable sources. You adjust your position slightly again, and the ground beneath you has become more uneven. Not unstable, but reshaped by repeated presence and subtle compression. Every body here contributes to the terrain inside the tent, slowly modifying it through simple rest. Outside, the wind changes direction briefly. You can tell not by seeing it, but by how the tent reacts. One side tightens more sharply, while the opposite side loosens. The entire shelter behaves like a responsive surface rather than a static object. Scholars still debate whether the perception of sound distortion during blizzards contributed more to psychological stress or to heightened survival awareness. But either way, it clearly affects how time and space are experienced inside shelters. You become aware of your breathing again. It feels slower now, more regulated, as if your body has adapted to the enclosed environment without conscious effort. Each breath is shared with the space, adding moisture and warmth that briefly reshape the interior air. The fire's influence is still present, though faintly filtered through layers of fabric and distance. It creates a soft, uneven glow that occasionally pulses through the tent interior when the wind shifts outside. A mainstream historical fact is that firelight inside winter shelters was not only a source of heat, but also a critical psychological stabilizer, helping groups maintain orientation and emotional balance during extended periods of isolation and storms. You notice how people inside the tent respond to these subtle changes. There is no conversation, but there is awareness, a small adjustment here, a slight repositioning there, all coordinated without words. It is a form of silent cooperation that feels almost instinctive now. The tent ceiling dips slightly again, and this time you watch it more carefully. Snow accumulation is continuing, but not evenly. Some areas sag more than others, depending on wind direction and structural support points. A lesser-known anecdote from expedition records suggests that experienced winter travellers could often read the safety of a shelter by listening to fabric tension sounds, using subtle acoustic changes to judge whether snow load was becoming dangerous. You realise you're beginning to do something similar, even without training. Your attention keeps returning to sound, to pressure, to the slight changes in how the tent responds to external force. Awareness is becoming adaptive. Outside, the storm continues without pause. It does not escalate dramatically, but it also does not weaken. It persists in a steady state of motion that feels endless when observed from inside. Your body remains still, but not passive. There is constant internal adjustment happening. Muscles shift slightly to maintain warmth. Clothing is subtly repositioned to block cold air leaks. Even posture becomes part of survival management. A reflective historical observation often made by researchers studying extreme cold environments is that human survival in such conditions depends heavily on continuous micro-decisions, many of which occur unconsciously after sufficient exposure. You feel a faint sense of time distortion again. It is difficult to know how long you have been here. Minutes and hours no longer feel distinct. They blend into cycles of adjustment, rest, listening, and stillness. The fire flickers again in the distance, and for a brief moment the tent interior brightens slightly. Shadows move softly across fabric surfaces, then settle again into muted tones. You notice how even that small change in light affects perception. The space feels larger for a moment, then smaller again when the light fades. The environment is constantly reshaping how you interpret distance. Scholars still debate whether sensory deprivation or sensory overload was the dominant psychological challenge in blizzard shelter survival. But here you experience both in alternating waves, depending on wind and fire and silence. You close your eyes briefly and listen. The storm is still there, always there, but it no longer feels like something external. It feels integrated into your environment, like a constant background condition that defines everything inside. Inside this fragile structure of fabric, breath, heat, and snow pressure, survival is not a moment, it is a continuous adjustment that never fully stops, and you remain part of that adjustment, quietly enduring as the night continues. You wake again, though it is not clear whether you actually slept or simply drifted into a thinner version of awareness where time stopped asking questions. The inside of the tent feels slightly different now, not warmer or colder in a direct way, but more settled, as if the storm outside has pressed everything into a more stable configuration. The fire is still present somewhere beyond immediate sight, its influence reduced but not gone. You can feel it in the faint, uneven warmth that lingers in the air, like a memory of heat rather than heat itself. Even that is enough to change how your body behaves. A widely recognized historical fact is that layered clothing systems, particularly those using wool and animal hides, were essential in pre-industrial cold environments because they trapped air pockets that reduced heat loss far more effectively than single thick garments. You adjust your clothing slightly, noticing how every layer has a role. The inner layer feels slightly damp from accumulated breath and body heat. The outer layers feel stiff and cold, acting as a barrier against the world beyond the tent. Nothing is purely comfortable here. Everything is functional. Outside, the storm continues, but its tone has shifted again. It is less chaotic now, more continuous. The wind does not surge as sharply, but it never stops either. It is like a long exhale that has no end. A quirky tidbit from historical travel accounts suggests that some winter travellers believed clothing could remember warmth, a poetic interpretation of how fabrics retained residual heat after being worn close to the body for long periods. Inside the tent, people begin to move more frequently again, not dramatically, but with slightly more intention. Someone adjusts a rope near the structure. Another checks the edge of a covering. The entire shelter feels like it is being quietly maintained through constant minor corrections. You notice how the ground beneath you has become more defined. The depression where you rest is slightly warmer than surrounding areas. It is shaped by repeated presence, almost like the environment is learning your body's outline. Scholars still debate whether early winter survival success depended more on environmental knowledge or on social coordination within small groups. But what you observe here suggests both are inseparable in practice. You sit up slowly, and the movement feels easier than before. Your body is still cold in places, but it is no longer shocked by the environment. Adaptation is becoming physical, not just mental. The fire's glow flickers faintly through layers of fabric again, creating soft pulses of light that ripple across the interior surfaces. It is not bright enough to dominate the space, but it is enough to remind you that controlled heat still exists somewhere nearby. A mainstream historical fact is that controlled fire use in enclosed or semi-enclosed winter shelters was one of the key developments that allowed human groups to survive extended exposure to extreme cold climates over long historical periods. You notice how your breathing has become more consistent. It no longer requires conscious regulation. The body has adjusted to the air, the temperature, and the shared environment. Even the sense of urgency has softened. Outside, the wind briefly intensifies again, and the tent responds immediately. Fabric tightens, then relaxes, like a living membrane reacting to pressure. The sound it produces is familiar now, almost expected. You begin to realize how much interpretation your mind is doing without instruction. Every sound, every shift in fabric, every change in light is being translated into meaning automatically. Survival here is partly perception training. A lesser-known anecdote from frontier winter diaries describes how experienced travellers could identify approaching storm changes not through sight, but through subtle shifts in the tone of wind against fabric and snow surfaces. Long before conditions visibly worsened, you lean back again, and the shared warmth around you feels slightly more stable than before. It is still fragile, but less erratic. Bodies nearby are still, but not rigid. There is a sense of quiet coordination, even without communication. Time continues to blur. You cannot tell how many cycles of rest and awareness have passed. The storm outside provides no markers, no shadows, no reliable changes in light. Scholars still debate whether the psychological difficulty of blizzard shelter survival came more from sensory monotony or from constant environmental unpredictability. But here you experience both as part of the same continuous condition. You close your eyes briefly again. The tent feels like a contained universe, defined by fabric, breath, firelight, and pressure from all sides. Nothing outside is visible, but everything outside is felt. Inside this enclosed space, survival is no longer an event. It is a state that continues without interruption, maintained by countless small actions and adjustments that never fully stop. And you remain inside that state, moving gently forward through time that no longer feels like time. You begin to notice hunger in a different way than you normally would. It is not sharp or urgent. It is muted, folded into everything else, as if your body has agreed to delay its complaints until conditions are safer. Even need becomes patient here. The inside of the tent has shifted again in subtle ways. The fire's influence is weaker now, but still present in faint waves of warmth that drift unevenly through the air. It is not enough to feel comfortable, but enough to prevent despair from taking hold. A widely accepted historical fact is that in many pre-industrial winter environments, food was often consumed in small, dense portions designed to provide long-lasting energy. Since frequent cooking was impractical during storms or prolonged cold exposure, you take a small portion of food when it's passed to you. It is firm, cold, and compact. You chew slowly, not because you want to savor it, but because even eating requires energy management. Everything here is measured in efficiency rather than enjoyment. Outside, the storm continues without visible change, but you can sense variations in pressure through the tent fabric. At times it feels like the wind is pressing evenly from all directions, and at other moments it feels directional, as if the world itself is tilting and correcting itself repeatedly. A quirky tidbit from historical accounts of winter travel suggests that some groups developed the habit of chewing slowly and deliberately during storms, believing it helped maintain internal warmth, though modern interpretation suggests it was more about conserving energy and focus. Inside the tent, movement is minimal but constant. Someone adjusts a covering near the edge. Another shifts slightly to maintain warmth distribution. These are not large actions. They are maintenance behaviors, repeated often enough that they become almost invisible. You notice how your perception of temperature has become more refined again. You can now distinguish tiny differences in warmth across your body. One side slightly warmer due to proximity to others. One shoulder slightly cooler due to exposure to airflow. Scholars still debate whether early survival in extreme cold was more dependent on caloric intake or on heat retention strategies. But here it is clear that both are intertwined, each affecting the other continuously. The fire flickers again faintly, and its light briefly expands across the tent interior. For a moment, everything feels more defined. Shadows sharpen slightly, then soften again as the flame stabilizes. You realize how dependent perception has become on that light. Without it, everything feels flatter, more uncertain. With it, even briefly, space feels organized again. A mainstream historical fact is that firelight in enclosed winter shelters played a crucial role not only in heating, but also in maintaining group coordination, allowing people to remain aware of each other's presence in conditions of near-total visual isolation. You shift your position carefully, and the ground beneath you responds with a soft compression. It is warmer than before, shaped by repeated contact. The environment is slowly adapting to repeated human presence, even as humans adapt to it. Outside, the wind intensifies briefly again, and the tent responds with a familiar sequence of tension changes. Fabric tightens, then loosens, then stabilizes. The rhythm of it has become predictable in a way that no longer triggers alarm. A lesser-known anecdote from frontier diaries suggests that experienced winter travelers could often estimate storm duration by observing how frequently tent structures adjusted under wind load. Treating structural rhythm as an informal timekeeping method, you become aware of how quiet your own thoughts have become. Not empty, but reduced in intensity. The mind is conserving itself, much like the body. There is no space here for unnecessary mental movement. Someone nearby shifts slightly closer to the center of warmth, and others subtly adjust in response. The distribution of heat is constantly being negotiated without speech, without planning, but with shared instinct. The storm outside remains constant. It does not respond to anything inside the tent. It simply continues its movement across the landscape, indifferent to effort, coordination, or survival. You notice how even breathing feels slightly warmer now than earlier. Not because the air has changed significantly, but because your body has adjusted to it. Adaptation is gradual, almost invisible, but continuous. Scholars still debate whether long-duration exposure to blizzard environments produced more physical exhaustion or psychological normalization. But what you are experiencing feels like both happening at once. You rest your hands closer to your body, conserving warmth. Even this small adjustment feels meaningful. Everything is reduced to small adjustments now. The tent interior feels like a carefully balanced system. Heat enters, heat leaves, movement redistributes it, breath modifies it. Nothing remains static. Everything is in motion, even when still. You begin to understand that survival here is not about achieving comfort. It is about maintaining a narrow corridor of livable conditions that must be constantly preserved through attention and restraint. And in that narrow corridor, time continues to pass without announcing itself. You start to realize that fear does not disappear in conditions like this. It simply changes shape. It is no longer sharp or sudden. It becomes quiet, stretched thin, like something that exists in the background of every thought without demanding attention. The tent feels slightly more enclosed now, as if the outside world has pressed closer during your last period of half-rest. The fabric above you holds steady, but you are more aware of its vulnerability than before. It is not failing, it is enduring. That difference matters here. A widely accepted historical fact is that in extreme winter conditions, prolonged exposure to storms often led groups to prioritize shelter maintenance and internal coordination over travel, sometimes remaining stationary for extended periods until weather conditions improved. You shift your weight slowly, and the movement feels heavier than expected, not because your body is weak, but because stillness has become the default state. Any motion feels like departure from safety, even when it is necessary. Outside, the storm continues its unseen pressure. The sound has not changed dramatically, but your perception of it has deepened. It is no longer just wind. It is structure, weight, and distance combined into one continuous presence. A quirky tidbit from historical travel narrative suggests that some explorers believe blizzards created a kind of psychological blank space, where normal emotional responses became muted, replaced by a focus on immediate physical survival needs. Inside the tent, someone exhales deeply, and the sound feels unusually loud in the enclosed space. It reminds you how sensitive hearing becomes when vision is limited and external reference points are gone. You notice how people are arranged now without any explicit instruction. The distribution of bodies is not random. It reflects an unspoken understanding of heat sharing, space conservation, and structural balance within the shelter. Scholars still debate whether such coordinated arrangements were culturally learned or instinctively developed through repeated exposure to cold environments, but what you see suggests that necessity quickly becomes shared behaviour. The fire is faint now, but still present in a distant glow. It no longer dominates attention, but it continues to shape the atmosphere subtly. Its absence would be immediately noticeable, even if it is not fully seen. You feel a slight draft again near the lower edge of the tent, and almost immediately someone adjusts a covering. The response is quick, practiced, and silent. It is clear that everyone is constantly monitoring the environment without needing to announce it. A mainstream historical fact is that in pre-modern cold weather survival settings, maintaining shelter integrity required continuous attention, as even minor gaps in insulation could significantly increase heat loss and threaten group survival over time. You notice your own breathing again, and it feels steadier than earlier, not warmer, but more adapted. The body has stopped reacting with urgency and has shifted into maintenance mode. Outside, the storm briefly intensifies, and the tent responds with a soft but noticeable tightening of fabric. The entire structure seems to inhale and exhale with the wind, as if it is participating in the storm rather than resisting it completely. A lesser-known anecdote from frontier accounts describes how some groups would listen for specific changes in tent sound patterns to detect shifts in wind direction, treating the shelter itself as a kind of sensory instrument. You begin to understand that survival here depends on interpretation. Every sound, every shift in air, every change in temperature is information. Nothing is neutral, everything has meaning. Your hands rest closer to your body again, conserving heat. Even this simple adjustment feels intentional, as if your body has learned to think in terms of thermal economy. The tent interior feels slightly smaller now, not physically, but perceptually. Awareness is condensed inward. The storm outside removes the need for distant thought. Everything is immediate. Scholars still debate whether prolonged isolation in blizzard shelters had more impact on physical endurance or cognitive focus. But here both are reduced and refined into something simpler, a continuous attention to survival conditions. You notice how the fabric above you occasionally flexes in slow, almost breathing motions. Snow load, wind pressure, and structural tension combine into a living rhythm that never fully stabilizes. There is a quiet sense of continuity now, not comfort, but consistency. The storm is ongoing, the shelter is ongoing, your awareness is ongoing. A reflective historical observation often made about extreme cold environments is that human perception gradually narrows to immediate survival inputs, filtering out unnecessary complexity in order to maintain functional awareness under sustained stress. You settle again into stillness, and stillness itself begins to feel structured. Even rest becomes an active state of conservation inside this fragile enclosure, surrounded by pressure that never stops. Survival continues not as a decision, but as a continuous condition, and you remain within it, moment by moment, without interruption. You begin to notice that even silence has layers here. It is not empty. It is filled with pressure, movement, and distant force. The storm outside does not need to be seen to be understood. It is always present, always pressing, always reshaping the thin boundary between survival and exposure. The tent feels slightly more stable now, though that stability is always conditional. You have learned by this point that nothing in this environment stays stable for long. It only stays stable long enough to matter. A widely accepted historical fact is that prolonged winter encampments during severe storms often required constant reinforcement of temporary shelters. Since snow accumulation and wind pressure could gradually alter structural integrity even without visible damage at first, you notice how your awareness of the tent has become sharper over time. You can now sense changes in tension across the fabric almost instinctively. A slight dip here, a subtle pull there, all of it registered without conscious effort. Outside, the storm shifts again, not in intensity but in direction. The change is subtle, but the tent responds immediately. One side tightens while another relaxes, like a slow adjustment in balance. The entire structure feels responsive, almost aware. A quirky tidbit from historical travel narratives suggests that some winter travellers described tents as listening skins, believing that shelters could react to storms in ways that reflected the landscape's hidden rhythms. While symbolic, it captures how closely people observe structural behaviour. Inside, someone adjusts a rope again. The movement is minimal but meaningful. Every adjustment feels like a small negotiation with the environment outside. Nothing is left unattended for long. You shift slightly, and the ground beneath you feels more defined than before. Repeated contact has shaped it into a subtle depression that holds warmth slightly longer than surrounding areas. Even the earth inside the tent is becoming part of the survival system. Scholars still debate a debate whether the psychological resilience observed in historical blizzard survival groups was primarily the result of environmental adaptation or social cohesion. But what you observe suggests both are inseparable in practice. The fire's presence is faint but still detectable. Like a distant memory of heat, it no longer dominates perception, but its absence would be immediately noticeable. It continues to influence behaviour subtly, drawing attention toward the centre of shared warmth. You notice how people inside the tent are no longer shifting frequently. Movements have decreased, not from exhaustion alone, but from adaptation. The body learns that stillness is more efficient than motion in this environment. A mainstream historical fact is that in extreme cold survival situations, energy conservation through reduced movement was as important as food intake. Since unnecessary motion could accelerate heat loss and increase physiological strain, you take a slow breath and feel the air inside the tent slightly warmer than before, not significantly, but enough to notice. The combination of bodies, fire, and insulation creates a fragile internal climate that exists only as long as it is carefully maintained. Outside, the wind briefly intensifies again, and the tent responds with a deeper structural reaction. You can hear the fabric strain slightly, followed by a slow return to equilibrium. It feels like the shelter is constantly correcting itself. A lesser-known anecdote from frontier winter records describes how experienced travellers could sometimes predict worsening conditions by observing how frequently tent supports required adjustment, interpreting structural instability as an early warning system. You become aware of your own stillness again. It is not forced. It is natural now. The environment has trained your body into efficiency. Even thought feels slower, more deliberate, less expansive. The tent interior has taken on a kind of quiet order, not perfect, but functional. Every element has a role, even if that role is simply to exist in balance with everything else. Scholars still debate whether long-duration exposure to blizzard environments led to heightened group dependency or increased individual resilience. But here those concepts merge into a single lived reality, where survival depends on both simultaneously. You notice how the fabric above you flexes in slow waves again, responding to shifting snow load and wind pressure. The motion is almost rhythmic now, like breathing, but not biological, environmental. Your hands remain close to your body, conserving heat. Even this small posture has become habitual. The body learns efficiency through repetition, not instruction. A reflective historical observation often noted in cold climate studies is that human perception gradually narrows under sustained environmental pressure, prioritizing immediate sensory feedback over abstract thought in order to maintain functional survival awareness. You feel that narrowing now, not as loss, but as focus. Everything unnecessary fades into the background. What remains is simple and immediate. The storm outside continues without interruption. The shelter inside continues without interruption. Between them, you exist in a narrow corridor of maintained conditions, and in that corridor, nothing is resolved. It simply continues. You begin to notice that your sense of time has become unreliable in a way that is no longer unsettling. It is simply part of how this place works. There is no sunrise to confirm beginnings, no sunset to confirm endings, only shifts in pressure, warmth, and sound that suggest movement through an invisible timeline. The tent feels slightly quieter now, though the storm outside has not truly weakened. Instead, your awareness has adapted to it, filtering out constant noise until only the most meaningful changes reach your attention. What once felt overwhelming now feels like background existence. A widely accepted historical fact is that many indigenous winter survival traditions in cold regions included highly efficient tent designs that balanced insulation, ventilation, and portability, allowing groups to endure extreme seasonal storms with remarkable resilience. You shift your position carefully and notice how the ground responds differently now. It is no longer just compressed earth and snow. It is a layered surface of warmth, memory, and repeated presence. The space beneath you has become part of the shelter system itself. Outside, the wind changes again, and the tent responds with a familiar sequence of tightening and release. You are beginning to recognize these patterns almost instinctively. The shelter is no longer just something you occupy. It is something you interpret. A quirky tidbit from historical travel accounts suggests that some winter groups believed tents had moods, describing calm periods and restless periods based on how the fabric behaved during storms. While symbolic, it reflects careful observation of environmental feedback. Inside, movement is minimal now. People have settled into positions that require less adjustment. The shared warmth has reached a kind of equilibrium, fragile, but consistent enough to reduce constant repositioning. You notice your breathing more clearly again. It is steady, slow, and adapted to the enclosed air. The tent contains everything now: breath, heat, moisture, sound. Nothing escapes without consequence. Scholars still debate whether survival in prolonged blizzard conditions depended more on technological adaptation or behavioral discipline, but what you are experiencing suggests that discipline itself becomes technology when resources are limited. The fire's presence is faint but still shaping the space. Its influence is no longer dramatic, but it continues to define the center of attention. Even when barely visible, it remains psychologically significant. You become aware of subtle shifts in temperature across your body again. One side slightly warmer due to proximity, another slightly cooler where air circulates. These gradients are small, but in this environment, small differences matter. A mainstream historical fact is that in extreme cold environments, maintaining consistent body temperature required continuous micro-adjustments in posture, clothing positioning, and group proximity, especially during long stationary periods such as sheltering in storms. Outside, the storm briefly intensifies again, and the tent reacts with a deeper tension. Fabric tightens, then slowly returns to its resting shape. The sound it produces feels familiar now, almost reassuring in its predictability. You realize that predictability itself has become important, not comfort, but understanding. Knowing how the shelter responds gives you a sense of orientation in an otherwise featureless environment. A lesser-known anecdote from frontier winter records describes how experienced travellers could often identify approaching changes in weather severity by listening to subtle shifts in the rhythm of wind interaction with tent surfaces and surrounding snow formations. You adjust your hands again, keeping them close to your body. Even this small movement feels deliberate. Everything is measured now. Energy is not wasted. Motion is purposeful or avoided entirely. The tent interior feels slightly more cohesive than before, as if all elements are settling into a shared state. Breath, fabric, firelight, and body heat form a temporary system that exists only through constant maintenance. Scholars still debate whether psychological endurance in extreme winter survival was more dependent on individual mental resilience or collective behavioral adaptation. But here, those distinctions blur into a single continuous experience. You notice how the storm outside no longer feels like an opposing force. It feels like a condition that defines everything inside the tent, not enemy, not background, but environment. Your awareness narrows again, but in a controlled way. It is not reduction, it is focus. Only what matters remains: present warmth, structure, breath, sound. The fabric above you shifts gently, almost like a slow inhale. Snow load and wind pressure continue to interact in unseen patterns, shaping the shelter moment by moment. A reflective historical observation often made in cold environment studies is that humans gradually develop heightened sensitivity to subtle environmental cues when exposed to prolonged extreme conditions, allowing survival through continuous interpretation rather than direct control. You settle deeper into stillness again, and stillness feels less like absence and more like maintenance. Even resting is part of the system. Inside this fragile structure, nothing is stable for long, yet everything continues to function through constant adjustment. And you remain within that balance, moving quietly through time that no longer feels separate from survival itself. You begin to sense that the storm outside is no longer something you are waiting to end. It has become the default condition of your world, like a ceiling that never lifts, instead of asking when it will stop. Your mind quietly adjusts to how life continues inside it. The tent feels more familiar now, though familiarity here does not mean comfort. It means recognition. You understand its movements better. You know how it reacts when wind shifts, when snow presses down, when breath gathers along the inner fabric and freezes into delicate patterns. A widely accepted historical fact is that many military campaigns and long-distance expeditions in cold climates were significantly shaped by winter storms, often forcing entire groups to pause movement and rely on temporary shelters for survival over extended periods. You shift slightly and notice how your body responds faster than before. Cold is still present, but it no longer surprises you. It has become something your senses account for automatically, like background information your body processes without asking for permission. Outside, the wind rises again for a moment, then settles into a steady flow. The tent answers in kind, tightening and relaxing in small structural pulses. You're starting to understand that this shelter is never truly still. It is always negotiating with the environment. A quirky tidbit from historical winter travel narratives suggests that some explorers describe the sound of tents in storms as resembling distant breathing, as if the shelters themselves were alive and participating in the struggle to remain upright. Inside, people remain close together. The spacing between bodies is not accidental. It reflects a shared understanding of heat conservation. Even without instruction, the arrangement maintains efficiency. Warmth circulates in a carefully unspoken pattern. You notice how your attention moves less frequently now. Earlier, every sound demanded focus. Now, only changes in sound draw your awareness. The constant background has been absorbed into perception. Scholars still debated a debate whether long-term survival in extreme cold environments depended more on physical adaptation or on learned behavioral efficiency within groups. But what you observe suggests that both evolve together until they cannot be separated. The fire is barely visible now, but its influence persists. It continues to define a subtle center within the tent, a reference point for warmth and orientation. Even reduced to faint glow, it still organizes attention. You feel a slight shift in air movement near your face. Someone adjusts a covering again, carefully controlling ventilation. Too much air would strip warmth. Too little would make breathing uncomfortable. This balance is constantly maintained without discussion. A mainstream historical fact is that enclosed heating sources in winter shelters required careful management of airflow to prevent both heat loss and dangerous buildup of smoke or depleted air quality, making ventilation as important as insulation. You breathe more slowly now, matching the rhythm of the space. Inhale, exhale, each cycle blending into the collective air inside the tent. Nothing feels separate anymore. Everything is shared, even if silently. Outside, the storm continues without variation that you can clearly detect. Yet your mind begins to interpret subtle differences in pressure as meaning. Not because they are truly meaningful, but because the brain searches for structure in repetition. A lesser-known anecdote from frontier accounts suggests that experienced winter travellers often claim they could feel when a storm was easing simply by the way tent fabric tension changed. Long before any visible improvement occurred, you lie back slightly, and the ground beneath you feels more integrated into your body now. It has become part of the system of warmth, not just surface, but support, insulation, and memory of presence. The tent interior feels stable in a fragile way. Nothing is guaranteed, but everything is functioning within acceptable limits. That is enough here. Scholars still debate whether human endurance in prolonged blizzard exposure is primarily driven by physiological resilience or by psychological acceptance of environmental limitation. But in this moment, both seem inseparable. You notice how even your thoughts are less expansive now. They are shorter, more immediate, less concerned with anything beyond the present conditions of warmth and structure. The fabric above you shifts again in a slow wave, responding to unseen pressure. It is a constant reminder that the boundary between inside and outside is never fixed. It is always being redefined. A reflective historical observation often noted in studies of extreme environments is that human perception gradually prioritizes immediate sensory feedback over abstract reasoning, allowing survival through continuous real-time adjustment rather than long-term planning. You remain still, not because you are resting fully, but because stillness is the most efficient state available. Even thought feels like something that should be conserved. Inside this shelter, survival is not marked by progress or change. It is marked by continuation, a steady persistence through conditions that do not resolve. And you continue within that persistence, moment by moment, without needing to name it. You begin to notice the cold in a more specific way now, as if your body has stopped treating it as a single sensation and started breaking it into layers. There is the cold of air movement near the edges of the tent, the cold of fabric that has absorbed the storm, and the deeper cold that sits in the ground beneath you. The tent feels quieter again, though it is not truly quiet. The storm outside continues its constant presence, but your mind now filters it differently. What once felt like overwhelming noise has become a structured background, something you interpret rather than react to. A widely accepted historical fact is that in extreme winter conditions, the onset of frostbite often occurred not in dramatic moments, but gradually and silently. particularly during periods of rest when awareness of limb temperature could decrease significantly. You flex your fingers slightly and feel how sensation returns unevenly. Some parts respond quickly, while others remain distant, as if they belong to a slightly different version of your body. That unevenness is no longer alarming. It is expected. Outside, the wind shifts direction again, and the tent responds with a familiar pattern of tension changes. The movement is almost predictable now, like a repeated conversation between structure and storm that never ends. A quirky tidbit from historical winter travel accounts suggests that some explorers believed frost itself could creep through tents like a living thing, describing it as something that advanced slowly during the night despite no visible breach in the shelter. Inside, the fire's influence is faint but persistent. It no longer dominates the space, but it continues to define a center of warmth that everything else subtly organizes around. Even reduced, it remains important. You notice how breathing inside the tent has become more uniform. Not identical, but harmonized through proximity. The shared air creates a rhythm that is not planned, but naturally emerging from survival conditions. Scholars still debate whether long-duration exposure to blizzard shelter environments had a greater effect on cognitive narrowing or on enhanced situational awareness. But here both seem to occur simultaneously, depending on momentary conditions. You shift your position carefully, and the ground beneath you feels more integrated with your presence than before. It is no longer just a surface. It is part of the thermal system that supports life inside the tent. A mainstream historical fact is that early winter survival groups often relied on continuous small adjustments in posture and positioning during sleep or rest periods to maintain circulation and reduce the risk of cold-related injury. Outside, the storm briefly intensifies again, and the tent responds immediately. Fabric tightens, then releases in a controlled way. The sound it produces has become familiar enough that it no longer triggers alertness, only recognition. You realize that familiarity itself has become a form of stability. Nothing in the environment is stable. Yet repeated exposure creates the illusion of predictability. A lesser-known anecdote from frontier winter records describes how experienced travelers could identify subtle shifts in storm severity by listening to changes in how snow interacted with tent surfaces, treating sound and pressure as combined indicators. You breathe more slowly again, noticing how your body now conserves energy almost automatically. Movement is minimized and less necessary. Even thought feels streamlined, avoiding unnecessary complexity. The tent interior feels slightly more enclosed, as if the storm has drawn closer again. This sensation is not based on visibility, but on pressure, sound, and subtle temperature change. Scholars still debate whether survival in prolonged blizzard conditions depended more on environmental adaptation or on learned group synchronization. But what is clear here is that both operate together seamlessly. You notice how your awareness has become more selective. You no longer track everything. Only changes matter now. Constant conditions fade into background acceptance. The fire flickers faintly, and for a moment the tent interior shifts in tone. Shadows move softly across fabric surfaces, then settle again. That brief change feels significant, even though it is small. A reflective historical observation often made in cold environment studies is that humans exposed to prolonged extreme conditions tend to develop heightened sensitivity to minor environmental fluctuations, while simultaneously ignoring constant background stimuli. You lie still again, and stillness feels increasingly like the default mode of existence. It is not inactivity, it is conservation. Outside, the storm continues without interruption, without response, without acknowledgement of anything inside the tent. Inside this fragile enclosure, life continues through adjustment, awareness, and shared endurance that never fully stops. And you remain within that continuity, moving quietly through a night that refuses to become morning. You begin to understand that closeness inside the tent is not emotional at first, but biological. The human body simply performs better when heat is shared. Only later does the mind attach meaning to that necessity, turning survival into something that feels like connection. The space around you has changed again in subtle ways, not physically larger or smaller, but socially reorganized through stillness. People have adjusted positions so many times that the current arrangement feels like a temporary equilibrium, held in place by warmth rather than intention. A widely accepted historical fact is that in extreme cold environments, group survival often depended on minimizing exposed surface area by clustering together during rest periods, reducing overall heat loss through shared body temperature regulation. You notice how breathing inside the tent feels more synchronized now, not because anyone is coordinating it, but because the environment naturally encourages slower, more efficient respiration. Even involuntary actions begin to adapt. Outside, the storm continues its endless movement, but your attention no longer returns to it as frequently. It is always present, yet no longer always central. Your mind has learned to treat it as background pressure rather than immediate threat. A quirky tidbit from historical winter accounts suggests that some travellers described group sleeping arrangements during blizzards as feeling like shared warmth fields. A poetic interpretation of the very real thermal benefit of close body proximity. You shift slightly and feel the subtle resistance of shared space. Every movement now affects others indirectly. Even minor adjustments ripple through the group, changing warmth distribution in ways that are immediately felt, even if not spoken about. Scholars still debate whether the psychological effects of close confinement in winter shelters were more influenced by stress from restriction or comfort from shared survival. But the lived reality often combined both in overlapping ways. The fire remains distant but present, its influence reduced to a faint ambient glow that still organizes attention within the shelter. Even when barely visible, it continues to act as a quiet center of orientation. You notice how your sense of time has blurred further. There is no clear distinction between rest, wakefulness, or waiting. Only cycles of awareness, adjustment, and stillness that repeat without formal boundaries. A mainstream historical fact is that many pre-industrial winter survival groups developed highly efficient communal resting strategies, where body positioning and shelter arrangement were optimized collectively to preserve heat during extended storms. You become aware again of the fabric above you. It moves in slow, almost breathing motions as wind and snow pressure shift outside. The movement is no longer alarming. It is expected, interpreted, and mentally mapped. Inside the tent, small adjustments continue. Someone tightens a support line, another shifts to reduce exposure near the edge. These actions are quiet, efficient, and continuous, forming a background rhythm of maintenance. You realize that silence here is not absence of action. It is action refined to its minimum expression. A lesser-known anecdote from frontier winter narratives describes how experienced groups would sometimes assign informal roles during storms, not through instruction, but through repeated habit, ensuring that shelter maintenance tasks were always being performed without explicit coordination. You feel your body settle deeper into shared warmth again. The sensation is not comforting in a soft sense. It is stabilizing in a functional sense. It reduces variability in temperature, which is what matters most here. Outside, the storm briefly shifts intensity again, and the tent responds immediately. Fabric tightens, then relaxes in a familiar sequence. The sound it produces is no longer something you analyze. It is something you recognize instinctively. Scholars still debate whether long-duration exposure to extreme winter environments led to greater social cohesion or greater individual adaptation. But here, both outcomes seem to emerge naturally from the same conditions. You notice that even thought has become more economical. Ideas appear and fade quickly unless they are directly relevant to immediate conditions. The mind prioritizes survival efficiency over exploration. The tent interior feels like a shared organism, not because it is alive, but because everything within it responds collectively to external pressure: breath, heat, movement, fabric, all interacting continuously. A reflective historical observation often noted in environmental anthropology is that human groups under sustained survival pressure tend to develop implicit coordination systems that function without formal communication, driven entirely by shared sensory feedback and necessity. You remain still again, and stillness is no longer passive. It is part of the system, a way of maintaining equilibrium within the shelter. Outside, the storm continues without change in purpose or awareness. Inside, life continues through adaptation that never pauses, and you remain within that shared adaptation, quietly existing in a space defined by warmth, breath, and endless wind. You begin to notice that the storm outside no longer feels like an event. It feels like geography, something permanent enough to shape how everything inside the tent behaves. Your mind stops expecting it to end and starts treating it as part of the landscape you currently live within. The tent feels slightly different again. Though the change is not obvious at first, it is more about how it holds pressure. The fabric tightens and relaxes in slower intervals now, as if the storm has settled into a steady rhythm rather than constant variation. A widely accepted historical fact is that many traditional winter cultures developed symbolic explanations for storms, often describing them as spirits or forces with intention, not because they lacked understanding, but because the scale of natural pressure exceeded ordinary language. You shift your hands closer to your body and notice how automatic that movement has become. Protection is no longer something you think about. It is something your body performs without instruction, like breathing or blinking. Inside the tent, the distribution of people has changed slightly again. Not dramatically, but in subtle repositioning that improves warmth efficiency. Someone closer to the edge adjusts inward. Another person shifts to fill the space left behind. No words are needed. A quirky tidbit from historical winter travel accounts suggests that some groups believed warmth could pool in certain parts of a shelter, depending on body arrangement. A folk interpretation of very real heat distribution patterns inside enclosed spaces. Outside, the wind changes direction briefly, and the tent reacts instantly. The shift is so familiar now that it no longer demands attention, only recognition. You can almost predict how the fabric will respond before it happens. Scholars still debate whether the psychological resilience observed in long-duration blizzard survival came from emotional hardening or from gradual normalization of extreme conditions, but here it feels like neither and both at once. You notice your breathing again, and it feels quieter than before, not weaker, just more efficient. Each breath is measured by necessity rather than awareness. The body is conserving effort in ways you did not consciously decide. The fire's presence is now faint, almost entirely reduced to suggestion. Yet even this minimal presence still affects the space. It creates a subtle reference point that prevents the interior from feeling completely uniform. A mainstream historical fact is that controlled heat sources in enclosed winter shelters were critical not only for physical survival, but also for maintaining group coordination and preventing disorientation during long periods of whiteout conditions. You become aware of how your perception of space has changed. Distances inside the tent feel more defined now. Even though visibility has not improved, you understand the environment through repetition rather than sight. Outside, The storm continues without variation that you can clearly distinguish anymore. It is no longer something you monitor. It is something you coexist with, constant, unchanging in essence, even as its surface fluctuates. A lesser-known anecdote from Frontier Winter Diaries describes how experienced travelers often stopped referring to time during prolonged storms, instead measuring existence by cycles of shelter maintenance, warmth redistribution, and rest intervals. You adjust your posture slightly, and the ground beneath you feels even more integrated into your body's sense of stability. The surface is no longer just physical support. It is part of the thermal system that keeps you within survivable limits. Inside the tent, everything continues in small motions. Fabric flexes, bodies shift, breath circulates. Nothing is still, even when nothing appears to move. Scholars still debate whether human survival in extreme cold environments is better understood as adaptation to physical conditions or adaptation to uncertainty itself. But what you experience suggests both are inseparable processes. You notice how attention now operates in a reduced but sharper form. You're aware of fewer things, but each awareness feels more precise. Only what matters for immediate survival remains in focus. The tent feels less like a structure now, and more like a temporary agreement between elements: heat, air, fabric, snow pressure, and human presence, all negotiating balance moment by moment. A reflective historical observation often made in cold climate studies is that prolonged exposure to environmental extremes often leads to a narrowing of perception, paired with increased sensitivity to small changes within that narrowed field of awareness. You remain still, and stillness feels increasingly like the most intelligent choice available, not because it is restful, but because it preserves equilibrium. Outside, the storm continues its endless movement across the landscape, indifferent and uninterrupted. Inside, life continues as a careful maintenance of balance that never fully resolves, and you remain part of that balance, quietly existing in the thin space between warmth and freezing wind. You begin to notice that even the idea of survival has changed meaning now. It is no longer something dramatic or urgent. It has become something continuous, like maintaining a small flame in conditions that constantly try to remove it. Nothing here is won, it is only maintained. The tent feels slightly more predictable now, though predictability is fragile in this environment. You can anticipate how it will react to wind shifts, how the fabric will tighten or loosen, how sound will change when pressure increases. These patterns become your only form of orientation. A widely accepted historical fact is that human survival in extreme cold environments has often depended on gradual accumulation of environmental knowledge, passed through repeated exposure rather than formal instruction, allowing groups to refine shelter practices over generations. You shift your position carefully and notice how your body now responds with minimal resistance. Movement has become economical. Every motion is measured against its cost in heat, effort, and stability. Even thinking feels more selective. Outside, the storm continues without clear variation, yet your perception of it has become more structured. You no longer experience it as chaos. You experience it as a system of pressure with familiar rhythms. A quirky tidbit from historical winter travel accounts suggests that some explorers believed storms had cycles of intention, describing periods where the wind felt almost deliberate in its consistency, a poetic way of interpreting long-duration environmental patterns. Inside the tent, people remain in close proximity, and the arrangement has stabilized further. There is an unspoken agreement in how space is used. Warmth is shared efficiently, and unnecessary movement is avoided almost instinctively. Scholars still debate whether the cohesion observed in small winter shelter groups was driven more by cultural structure or by physiological necessity. But in practice, both forces seem to merge into a single survival behavior. You notice how your attention has become extremely focused. There is less mental wandering now. Thoughts appear only when relevant to immediate conditions. Everything else fades quickly, almost automatically. The fire's presence is now barely perceptible, but its influence remains embedded in the atmosphere. Even minimal heat alters perception, creating a subtle distinction between centre and edge within the shelter. A mainstream historical fact is that controlled heating in enclosed winter shelters played a decisive role in enabling prolonged human habitation in regions that would otherwise be unlivable during seasonal extremes. You breathe slowly, noticing how your respiration has adapted further. It requires less conscious regulation. The body has optimized itself for low energy conditions, conserving effort wherever possible. Outside, the wind briefly intensifies again, and the tent responds with a familiar sequence of structural tension. Fabric tightens, holds, then gradually returns. The sound is no longer alarming. It is expected. A lesser-known anecdote from frontier winter diaries describes how experienced travellers often described shelter sounds as a kind of environmental language, where each shift in fabric or rope tension indicated changes in storm behaviour. You adjust your hands slightly, keeping them close to your body. Even this small adjustment feels intentional, as if every action must justify its energy cost. Inside the tent, everything continues in quiet coordination. No one directs it. It simply happens through shared understanding and repeated necessity. Movement is minimized. Warmth is preserved. Stability is maintained. Scholars still debate a debate whether long-duration exposure to extreme winter environments results in greater emotional detachment or deeper social interdependence. But what emerges here feels like a blending of both tendencies. You realize that your sense of time has become almost irrelevant. There are no clear markers anymore, only cycles of awareness, rest, adjustment, and observation that repeat without distinct boundaries. The tent feels like a temporary ecosystem now, sustained by constant balance between internal heat and external pressure. Nothing inside is independent. Everything interacts. A reflective historical observation often noted in environmental anthropology is that humans in extreme conditions often shift from time-based perception to process-based perception, where events are understood through cycles of maintenance rather than chronological progression. You remain still, and stillness feels increasingly natural. It is not enforced. It is chosen by circumstance. The most efficient way to exist in this environment is to reduce unnecessary change. Outside, the storm continues its uninterrupted movement, unchanged in purpose or awareness. Inside, life continues through quiet adaptation that never fully pauses, and you remain within that adaptation, existing in a space defined not by comfort, but by sustained balance. You realize now that the storm has stopped being something you experience and has become something that defines the edges of your entire reality. It is no longer outside in any meaningful emotional sense. It is simply the condition that makes the inside possible. The tent feels different again, but only because you are different now. Your awareness has narrowed into a steady, quiet focus that tracks warmth, breath, pressure, and the smallest changes in sound. Everything else has faded into irrelevance without effort. A widely accepted historical fact is that many winter survival accounts from extreme blizzard environments describe the most dangerous period not as the height of the storm, but the moments of prolonged exposure when fatigue and environmental pressure combine to reduce alertness over time. You shift slightly, and the movement feels smooth now, almost efficient. Your body has learned the cost of unnecessary motion. Even rest is structured around conserving energy and preserving heat distribution within the shelter. Outside, the storm continues, though your perception of it has softened further. It is no longer a series of events. It is a continuous presence, like breath that never stops moving across the landscape. A quirky tidbit from historical winter narratives suggests that some travellers described storms as living ceilings, imagining the sky itself pressing down with intention, a poetic reflection of how enclosed conditions distorted perception of space. Inside the tent, the arrangement of bodies remains stable. There is no need for correction now. Everyone has settled into positions that maximize warmth and minimize exposure. It feels less like coordination and more like inevitability. Scholars still debate whether prolonged shelter survival in extreme cold environments created stronger communal bonds or simply reinforced practical dependency. But what you observe makes the distinction almost meaningless in practice. The fire is barely perceptible now, reduced to a faint influence that still organizes the center of attention, even when it is no longer visually dominant. Its presence is more memory than sight. A mainstream historical fact is that firelight in enclosed winter shelters often served as both a physical and psychological anchor, helping groups maintain orientation and cohesion during long periods of environmental isolation. You notice your breathing again, and it feels almost automatic now. Each inhale and exhale blends into the shared atmosphere inside the tent. Air is no longer just surrounding you. It is part of a collective system. Outside, the wind briefly shifts, and the tent responds with a familiar structural reaction. Fabric tightens, holds, then slowly relaxes. You no longer interpret this as instability. You interpret it as normal function. A lesser-known anecdote from frontier accounts describes how experienced winter travellers would sometimes read shelter movement the way others read written language, using fabric tension and sound as indicators of changing conditions. You become aware of how little mental effort is now required to exist here. Thoughts are shorter, more focused, and always relevant to immediate survival conditions. Everything else dissolves quickly. The tent feels like a shared organism sustained by constant equilibrium. Heat is distributed. Air is managed. Movement is minimized. Nothing is independent. Everything contributes to balance. Scholars still debate whether human adaptation to extreme cold is primarily physiological or behavioral, but what you experience suggests that both merge into a single continuous system of response. You remain still, and stillness no longer feels like restraint. It feels like alignment with the environment. The most efficient way to exist is to reduce resistance to conditions that cannot be changed. Outside, the storm continues without interruption or awareness of time passing. Inside, survival continues as a quiet, ongoing state of maintained balance between warmth and cold, presence and pressure, breath and fabric. And you remain within that balance as it slowly carries you through the night, until even the idea of night begins to dissolve. Now the wind softens in your perception, the fabric steadies in its slow rhythm, and the world becomes less about endurance and more about simply continuing to exist. Your awareness drifts, not into escape, but into calm suspension. The storm is still there, but it no longer defines you. It only surrounds you, and in that final quiet understanding, you let go into stillness, where survival no longer feels like struggle, only continuity, sweet dreams, sweet